Inside the murder castle, the true horror of H. Holmes's capture. On a cold, grim evening in Chicago during the 1890s, a city mired in ambition, vice, and secrets, a monstrous figure crept through the fog of civilization. His name, if it could ever be called that without irony, was H. Holmes. Born Herman Webster Mudgett, he had reinvented himself time and again, weaving a dark tapestry of scams, frauds, and unimaginable atrocities. Today, we transport you into a shadowy world of murder, mystery, and uncompromising horror, chronicling the capture of one of America's most infamous serial killers in a documentary style that blurs the lines between history and nightmare. The rise of a monster. In the later decades of the 19th century, Chicago was a city of dreams and grit, a burgeoning metropolis wherein fortunes could be made, and equally, lives could be lost in obscurity. Against this backdrop emerged Herman Webster Mudgett, a precocious child from New Hampshire who showed promise in both the halls of prestigious schools and the corridors of academia. Enrolling in medicine at the University of Michigan, he demonstrated brilliance in the anatomy department, a field that would soon become the perfect cover for his sinister pursuits. It was there, surrounded by cadavers and the stark reality of life's fragility, that Mudgett's dark inclinations began to stir. Casting aside his birth name, he adopted the moniker H. Holmes, a persona that would soon take on a life of its own. His early crimes, cloaked in the guise of insurance fraud and staged accidents, hinted at a diabolical engineering of death. With a courteous smile and a burning ambition, Holmes traversed the country, leaving behind fractured families and emptied bank accounts. Yet, as the body count rose and whispers of murder spread through the underbelly of society, the curtain was slowly drawn back on the true horror of his deeds. The birth of a house of horrors. By the early 1890s, Holmes had set his sights on Chicago, a city whose rapid industrialization offered endless opportunity for both wealth-making schemes and exploitation of its most vulnerable citizens. At the heart of his Chicago operation was a building situated at the notorious intersection of 63rd and Wallace Streets. Ostensibly a modest structure with stores on the ground floor and apartments above, the building was, in truth, a labyrinth bent on enclosing unspeakable evil. Soon, the edifice acquired a grisly nickname, the Murder Castle. Its exterior betrayed nothing of the unholy experiments within. Inside, however, the architecture defied logic. Corridors twisted and turned into dead-end passages, secret rooms revealed hidden chambers accessible only via trapdoors and sliding walls, and the basement, was a subterranean gallery of horrors. There, voices of the past seemed to echo among vats of acid capable of dissolving human flesh into a formless mush, along with dismemberment tables and a peculiar stretching rack, an instrument designed to inflict prolonged agony and terror. Holmes was a master architect of fear. He installed contraptions that mimicked alarms. Cleverly concealed bells would toll whenever a door was opened or a peculiar step was taken, alerting him to intruders. Such measures were intended to keep his victims imprisoned in rooms designed to suffocate, starve, or be systematically dismantled. It was in this grim maze that countless souls became ensnared, their lives extinguished in ways so macabre that even the most hardened observers would shudder upon learning the details. The trail of blood and lies. Even as the walls of his castle swallowed lives whole, smoke began to rise from the seams of Holmes's carefully constructed web of deceit. Insurance policies taken out on unsuspecting victims, forged identities, and a trail of missing persons slowly coalesced into a pattern too ghastly to ignore. Among the lost were not just faceless individuals, but wives, children, and even acquaintances who had once trusted him. Witnesses began to murmur of strange noises emanating from the building at odd hours, a distant clatter in a dark hallway, or the damp stench of chemicals creeping up from below. Survivors, those who managed to escape his deadly embrace, recounted their encounters with a man of startling charm who could lull you into a false sense of security with his genteel manners, only to reveal a heart as barren as the unmarked graves beneath his property. What truly set the stage for his ultimate downfall was a series of insurance scams that raised red flags even in the murky world of criminal enterprise. Holmes's maneuvers grew ever more brazen. In one instance, having staged a fire in his own building to claim a hefty life insurance policy, he inadvertently provided investigators with a tantalizing glimpse of the monstrous discrepancies in his story. As creditors and rivals began to close in, painting him as a man who had outstayed his welcome in the realm of deceit, the law began to tighten its grip around him. The investigation unfolds. It was the autumn of 1894, and Chicago's underworld was already abuzz with unsettling rumors. An astute investigator known only as F.G. Cowie began to peel back the layers of Holmes's carefully shrouded identity. Combining evidence from insurance companies, fragmented testimonies from missing family members, and anonymous tips from those who dared to speak of harrowing incidents, Cowie and his team honed in on the elusive suspect. One of the most chilling breakthroughs came from the discovery of remnants, bits of human teeth, dismembered limbs, and the scattered personal belongings of individuals who had vanished without a trace. These clues were not found in the streets, but deep within the labyrinthine corridors of the murder castle itself. It was as if every room, every hidden passage, was an unspoken confession of the evil that had taken place within those walls. The investigation took on the feel of a modern horror saga. Detectives pored over ledgers filled with ill-gotten insurance claims and scrutinized architectural blueprints that detailed not only the layout of the building but hinted at secret rooms and trap mechanisms. Gradually, the mosaic of evidence painted a picture of a man who was not merely a con artist but a meticulously calculating murderer. A man whose twisted vision of immortality involved not just the taking of lives but the transformation of the human form, a grotesque ambition to create a race of giants through perverse experiments on his victims. The night of reckoning. As October crept in, the noose of suspicion tightened. The whispers of missing persons, the financial records of fraudulent policies, and the blood-chilling evidence from the murder castle had proven too overwhelming to conceal. The police, acting on a mounting body of circumstantial evidence, orchestrated a raid that would forever imprint the horrors of H. Holmes into criminal history. Under the pallid glow of gaslit streets, a team of detectives approached the foreboding structure on 63rd and Wallace. Rain slicked the pavement, and a chill wind carried with it an unspoken promise of retribution. The officers knew that within this building lay the culmination of one man's depravity, a mass of secrets encoded in iron, stone, and the remnants of shattered lives. With trepidation and resolve, they breached the entrance. The first impression was one of utter confusion. Corridors that defied direction, rooms that appeared and disappeared before one's eyes, and a pervasive silence that felt loaded with grief and malice. Every step taken inside was a step into the unknown, into the very heart of darkness. It wasn't long before they discovered a series of false walls and secret passageways. One officer, trembling as he traced his hand along a cold metal latch embedded in an unremarkable hallway, inadvertently triggered one of Holmes's self-installed alarms, a faint, insistent bell that echoed like the tolling of a death knell. In that moment, the investigators realized that every crevice of the building had been designed with a single, sinister purpose: to hide the unspeakable crimes that had been committed there. In the labyrinthine basement, the true horror manifested. Amid vats of corrosive acid, remnants of human bones, and what reeked of both decay and chemical burns, the officers found evidence that defied rationality. There, in a modest yet unmistakable operating area, lay the tools of dismemberment and severance, the very instruments of an experimental butcher. Horrific details emerged: an operating table stained with the legacy of human agony, contraptions capable of stretching a body beyond natural limits, and myriad toxins left in vats that whispered of an alchemical desire to erase all traces of flesh. Every new discovery only deepened the puzzle. The layout of the house, the mysterious alarms, and the final, damning pieces of evidence seemed to murmur, "He is here. He is the architect of all this horror." The officers, seasoned by years of facing Chicago's underbelly, now found themselves standing within the physical manifestation of a madman's nightmares. At that fateful moment, as the last vestiges of evidence were being documented and the detectives' flashlights illuminated grotesque relics of past crimes, Holmes's carefully constructed veil of deceit began to crumble. The relentless force of law and order had cornered him within his own monstrous creation. Holmes was not a man to be easily taken by surprise. Throughout his career, he had deftly avoided detection through cunning changes of identity and calculated manipulations. Yet, the sheer scale of the evidence was a burden too heavy even for him to bear. As the officers continued their meticulous search, a trap, likely set by Holmes himself, was inadvertently sprung by one of the lawmen. Instead of a continuation of his carefully choreographed routine, a series of secret doors swung open, revealing a hidden corridor that led directly to a claustrophobic, dimly lit chamber. Within that chamber, the detectives found Holmes cowering in the flickering shadows, a stark contrast to the confident, manipulative persona he had maintained throughout his criminal career. In that desperate moment, the reality of his capture was undeniably clear. Here was a man whose intellect and charm had once eluded the grasp of justice, now laid bare before the iron will of the law. In a tension-filled standoff, Holmes attempted one last mendacious gambit, a plea for mercy wrapped in convoluted legal jargon, insisting on his own eligibility as counsel. But the evidence was overwhelming. The accounts of missing persons, the physical documentation of grisly experiments, and the confirmation of fraudulent financial dealings sealed his fate. With no avenue left for escape, the once calculated killer was apprehended, his capture marking a turning point in the dark saga that had haunted the city for years. The aftermath and the courtroom drama. In the days that followed, the city of Chicago was abuzz with grim fascination. Journalists, detectives, and ordinary citizens who had long harbored nightmares about the unsolved disappearances gathered to watch as the layers of Holmes's monstrosity were peeled back in a series of public hearings. On October 28, 1895, in a trial that seemed pulled from the fevered imagination of a horror novel, Holmes took the stand to represent himself, a macabre spectacle that confounded even the most seasoned legal professionals. His trial was as much a media circus as it was a search for justice. Detailed testimonies from witnesses, forensic reconstructions of the hidden basements and secret rooms, and the painstaking documentation of police discoveries painted a picture that was both mesmerizing and repulsive. The evidence left little room for doubt. Over the years, hundreds of lives had been sacrificed on the altar of Holmes's twisted ambition. The legends that had once obscured his real identity were replaced by the hardcore, chilling reality of his deeds. As details emerged of scams that involved daring life insurance frauds, of marriages contracted solely for financial gain, of identities borrowed and discarded, a portrait of a man whose soul was as hollow as the secret rooms in his castle also took shape. His machinations had trickled into every facet of his life. He had negotiated his way through alliances with notorious criminals like Benjamin F. Pitzel, manipulated grieving widows, and even engineered the disappearance of his own family members. Every crime, every lie, every broken promise converged into the final indictment that was laid out before the court. The public was riveted by the process. The chamber was thick with uneasy silence as whispers of the murder castle, the gas chambers, and the twisted experiments on human bodies circulated in hushed, awed tones. By the time his trial concluded, the weight of his crimes had become an indelible scar on the collective memory of Chicago. The end of a nightmare. On May 7, 1896, the final act in this real-life horror story was played out. H. Holmes, the man who had embodied a nightmare born of arrogance and depravity, was sentenced to death, a hanging that would become yet another macabre footnote in his legacy. Reports of that day told of a calm, almost eerily detached demeanor as he was led to the gallows. Witnesses later recounted how his neck did not break immediately, his body twitching for a full 15 minutes before life was finally extinguished. In his final moments, as reporters clamored for a glimpse into the soul of the condemned, Holmes was said to have uttered words that encapsulated his fear of posthumous exploitation, a plea to be buried deep under layers of concrete, to keep his body hidden from those who might desecrate it and harvest the remains that had once been part of his grisly experiments. The execution itself was a dark punctuation mark to a story filled with horror and injustice. A story of a man who had built an empire on misery and had, in the end, been consumed by the very darkness he had propagated. It was a moment that resonated with the collective relief of a city that had lived in perpetual dread of his reach. Reflections on evil and legacy. Even now, more than a century later, the name H.H. Holmes endures as a byword for unspeakable terror. His story is a chilling reminder of what can occur when unchecked ambition and monstrous intent collide with the vulnerabilities of human society. Chicago, a city celebrated for its resilience, learned through the ordeal of the murder castle that true evil often hides behind polite conversation, that behind a veneer of sophistication can lie a labyrinth of darkness. The capture of H.H. Holmes was not a single moment of triumph. It was the culmination of persistent investigation, the painstaking assembly of fragments of lost lives, and the unyielding determination of law enforcement to bring a killer to justice. It was a victory carved out of blood and betrayal, a testament to the fact that no matter how many doors one might hide behind, or how many lives one might claim, the truth eventually finds a way to reveal itself. In the echoes of that haunted castle, in the cold remains of the basement and the scattered remnants of lives once vibrant and full of hope, there exists a grim chronicle, a chronicle that warns us to remain vigilant, that reminds us that beneath the surface of everyday life, horrors can brew that defy our wildest nightmares. The story of H.H. Holmes's capture is not merely a record of one man's fall from grace. It is a saga of inevitability, a dance between darkness and the light of human perseverance, one that continues to captivate and horrify those who dare to peer into the depths of history. As investigators unearthed the physical remnants of his atrocities, they also dismantled the intricate layers of deception that had allowed him to roam free for so long. In doing so, they offered a sobering lesson, that the pursuit of truth is relentless, and that even the most cunning evil will one day be brought to justice. And so, as we close this chapter of true horror, we are left with lingering questions. What drove a bright, promising young man from New Hampshire to become the architect of a death trap so elaborate and cruel? Was it an insatiable thirst for power, an obsession with defying nature, or simply the corrupting allure of easy wealth derived from the misery of others? The answers remain shrouded in the same darkness that enveloped his crooked corridors and secret rooms. Ultimately, the capture of H.H. Holmes stands as a testament to the enduring resolve of a society determined to confront its nightmares head-on. In that fateful raid on his murder castle, in the cold, unyielding eyes of the detectives and the triumphant yet somber stroke of justice in the courtroom, the specter of Holmes was finally exorcised. His name, once synonymous with cunning and terror, was forever consigned to the annals of history, a dark legend from which, perhaps, modern society might learn to keep its own demons at bay. May this true horror documentary account serve not only as a record of the atrocities committed by one man but also as a beacon of warning, that evil, in whatever form it may take, will always leave behind traces, no matter how well hidden in the labyrinths of dark ambition and cruel ingenuity. In a tale as intricate as the corridors of his murderous abode, H.H. Holmes's capture is a chilling chapter in the endless struggle between humanity and the darkness that sometimes dwells within it. It reminds us that even in an era of rapid progress and glimmering hope, there always lies a shadow waiting to pounce, one that, when confronted by determined souls, will inevitably be brought into the light. This is the end of this video. If you love listening to these true horror stories, then do like, share, and subscribe to Horror Vault to watch our upcoming videos.